Space, the final frontier. We are all fascinated by human attempts to reach faraway galaxies, but going out into space also gives us a unique perspective to see the planet Earth and measure it in ways we cannot do from here. One very important field which relies more and more on space technology is climate action. I'm here with Vice President of the European Commission, Šefčovič, and 3 experts who are making smart use of space tech for fighting climate change. We will hear from them, but most importantly, we would like to hear from you. We are now simultaneously live on the main accounts of the European Commission on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and on the Vice President's LinkedIn account. During this conversation, I invite you to leave your comments, questions, and suggestions, and I will try to bring as many of your voices to the Vice President and the panel. As always, I'm equipped with a tablet to look at your comments. Here's your chance to ask or pitch your best ideas to those who shape the future of Europe's space and climate policies. So let me quickly introduce our 4 guests in the studio. As I said, Šefčovič, Vice President of the European Commission in charge of the Energy Union and the EU Space Strategy. We have Freya Famborg. He's a senior scientist of the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, which is running the Copernicus Climate Change Service. If you're lost, that's okay. We will explain what this is all about in a moment. Francesca La Rosa is a researcher at the Euro-Mediterranean Centre on Climate Change and co-founder of Balance Shift. And Jill Lizcano, Director of Research and Development at Vortex. So now we know who we are. I'd like to start with you, Vice President. You've done this kind of crowdsourcing of ideas before, but this time we have a very specific question that we'd like to ask on space and climate. Why these 2 and why now?
I think that we are really very lucky with the timing because we have actually very special time of the year going on. Not only I just came back from the climate summit from COP24 from Katowice, but at the same time I know that there are very intense and interesting discussions going on in Marseille. We have a space week where I know that our participant took part in the discussion. And I think we Europeans should be also very proud that just 10 days ago we presented to the whole world, and I was very glad to bring that message to Katowice. How can we make our economy climate neutral as of 2050? And I know that we need all technologies on board, and I think that space and space technology would be key to achieve it, to have better monitoring, to really know what's happening on our planet, and to have much better picture of what we humans did to Mother Earth and how we should correct it. So therefore I'm glad that I have young innovators and researchers with me, because I'm sure they can present it even in a more plastic vision and picture than I can do.
So let's hear what it is that they are doing. I'll start with you, Freya. Explain to us, so you're working for one international organization, but you're also working on the climate service of Copernicus. How does that work?
So if we start with Copernicus, so for those who don't know it, it's a huge EU program that's dedicated to space. So it contains a space segment which is about satellites, the very most cutting-edge satellites for observing the Earth. But in addition to this program with the satellites, there are also a number of services to make sure that the data we get from these satellites is actually used by as many as possible across Europe, but also across the world, because the data is free and open. And the Climate Change Service uses this data from the satellites, but also data from past satellite missions, but also from data from actually ground-based data sets, but also models, to bring information to a wide audience to make more climate-smart decisions.
So if I understand you correctly, the EU shoots satellites into space, you guys come in, you take the data that the satellites manage to collect on Earth, and you process them in a way that anybody can then use?
Yeah, so the idea is to process both the satellite data to, let's say, look at what sea level rise has been since the start of the satellite era, or a little bit later in the case of sea level, but also to combine this kind of information into computer models, much like we would do for a weather forecast, for instance, but to look back in time. And then we have a record not only of what a satellite has seen, but also a combined record that gives us an idea of the past state of the climate, but also the current state of the climate.
So if I want to now plug into the data that comes from the EU satellites, what do I need to do?
You can either come to our website, the Climate Data Store.
Download the data?
You can download the data, but you can also process the data online, because this is one of the big issues, I think, with satellite data. It has huge quantities. So for some, you can process that, but for some you really need a processing step in between, not only for a knowledge process, so to say, but also actually data reduction process.
We might go back to the question of cloud services for smaller companies that don't have the processing power, but I don't want to lose audience that are now hearing big words and don't understand what we're talking about. You told me that it was easy to get the data from your website, and we have two cases here of Europeans who are actually making use of your data. And I'd like to turn to you, Francesca. You developed a whole business model, if I understand correctly, of using this Copernicus satellites data. What do you do with that data?
Well, as a researcher, of course, we use this data and the post-process data, therefore the products that ECMWF and the Copernicus Climate Change Service provide to provide cutting edge, let's say, research frontiers. But also, in terms of business model and business opportunities, this data and these products can be part of a vibrant communities where climate change matters for business, because it's not anymore a threat, but it's turned into an opportunity. And this opportunity can generate not just new services to support decision-making, but also new job opportunities, new technological advancement.
Example, what do you do with the data that you, how do you monetize it? How do you turn it into a business?
Well, at the moment we are in the development phase, because actually we're supported by the Copernicus Accelerator program.
So what is the Copernicus Accelerator program?
Is a scheme that is funded at European level for 50 startup ideas and concepts to build them throughout 10 months' time in order to bring them to a market level. So we are followed up by a specific mentor that was assigned to us that helps us and develops our concept, bringing it into the market. So it's not anymore just a research product, but it becomes relevant for market purposes.
Okay. And you also told me that you're helping other Italians who want to use that data. So you communicate to them how to best use the data of the Copernicus data store? Is that correct?
because the Copernicus Climate Change Service launched this initiative that is called Train the Trainers, where trainers specifically per countries are selected to give in-country trainings in their own language, selecting within their networks to spread the awareness about this data, but also to show how this data can be helpful.
Somebody gives you a call and says, Francesca, I don't know how to handle this data. It's too big, it's too complicated, come show me.
It can happen, but normally what you give is a blended trainer that is composed by webinars and face-to-face events. And during these activities, you're actually in touch with people, with these participants to these trainings. Therefore, it's easier for them also to interact in terms of solve this problem. And all these initiatives are coming from Copernicus Climate Change Service, therefore from the European Union.
And maybe taking one step backwards from Copernicus, the Vice President mentioned the EU Space Week, and I heard that you took part in some of the activities. You were in Marseille here.
Yeah.
So what happened in Marseille this week?
What happens is that I saw really a vibrant communities of entrepreneurs and the vibrant communities of European activities that are all in a way trying to communicate and cooperate together. And this is a very important point in my view, fostering the cooperation between different communities, because actors are actually eager to use climate change information in order to create new opportunities. In Marseille, there is the space industry that meet and discuss about different sectors and different opportunities. And there are also the Copernicus Masters, the Copernicus Accelerator of this year and last year, but everything that is connected to the incubation of new entrepreneurial realities, and of course, every Copernicus service, so from land monitoring to the climate change service as well.
Okay. Turning to Jill, but before I ask you about what you're doing at Vortex, there were a few comments, I'm trying to trace them now, of people basically saying, what's the point of sending satellites into space? It's going to be too late by the time we see that climate change is happening to do anything about it. Others are saying you're just polluting by sending out rockets. Some, not everyone. But I'd like you to explain a little bit what you're doing with the data that we get from Copernicus, because I understand that you're trying not just to see climate change when it's already done, but you're also trying to prevent it from happening.
Okay, yes, we are probably one of the users from the wind energy industry that has downloaded more data from Copernicus. What we do is Vortex, my company, is a software as a services, so we provide access to virtual data, wind resource virtual data, that allows the user from the wind industry to accelerate the development of the project. So we provide information information about where the best sites are located, which is the expected wind speed that you will get, which is the long-term wind speed on your project. So basically what we do is to facilitate an online platform where users can get this information from wind resource based on many models, but behind these models there is Copernicus data that is our main sources for this dance.
So if I have to simplify, you take the data that you get from Freya's service,
Yes.
you download it, you process it, and you manage to figure out what's the best place to put a windmill
Yes.
that would be the most effective to produce clean energy.
We provide this information through an interface to the user from the industry that they have to take a decision, and they use several sources, on-site measurements, and also virtual data as the one we provide.
And you also told me earlier that you're doing a project with the World Bank where you're trying to map the whole world about the best places to put a windmill. Is that correct?
Yes, this is a very important project developed by the World Bank, where we are putting in place, or is the World Bank who put in place an interface, a web page to map the global resources and to provide this data in an open interface. So the users especially from new markets in developing countries, they can have this information to start developing the projects.
Okay, so that's basically, that means that the World Bank's future map, the project that you're working on, will all be using the EU satellites Copernicus data?
It's already operational.
Yeah.
It's the case. We used one version of the Copernicus data, and next year there will be an update with the newest version of Copernicus data that has been integrated in our system.
So, Vice President, I'd like to turn one of the questions we got here from you. This is from Mike Ford, who posted it on Facebook, and he's asking whether, given that we're using the Copernicus data in different fields, he's mentioning agriculture and movement of goods, and he's saying, shouldn't we have standards all around the world so that we all use this data in a way that we can share it? We hear from Jill that everybody's using Copernicus data now, but should we do it in a way that everybody's using the same standards? He's actually, for once, proposing that the EU would regulate standards. Usually, the EU is attacked for regulating standards, but he's saying, why don't you regulate standards so that everybody can use that data in the same way? What do you think about that?
I think that's the proof that Copernicus is actually a big European success, because this is really the best Earth observation space infrastructure on this planet. That really the quality of the data and the fact that it's used all over the world. And when I'm traveling even to the United States, so very often the NASA officials are the first one to congratulate us on the success of Copernicus and on the quality of data they are using for their space mission. They are using when they are trying to tackle the consequences of the different weather-related disasters. So this is very important, and I'm also very happy about that aspect of the question. It just demonstrates how the space data and Copernicus data could be universally used. And I can tell you that also in my field of work, we use it for transport, we use it for smart grids in energy networks, we use it for agriculture. We can measure if the forestry management is properly done in our member states. We see the degradation of the icebergs and all the, I would say, direct consequences of the climate change. So that's the big contribution to really fighting the climate change. And the previous question, which was also linked to this one, that how this Earth observation program is actually helping the climate change. I think we have to know that to be more precise about the dimension of climate change, that you have certain something like 50 indicators, and 35 of them you can get only thanks to our satellites. So we wouldn't be able to observe, you know, all that sea levels movement, acidity of our seas, or overheating of the surface of Earth, and many other indicators which are so important for really measuring what's happening with our planet. So we need the satellites to be much more precise about what's happening on Earth. And concerning the standards, of course, that's an ambition of the European Union, that we clearly are leaders in this aspect. And we would look for the ways how to make this data even more available to the common citizens, because I know that computing power is a challenge, and therefore I'm really thankful to our innovators to make it, let's say, more user-friendly, that we do not have to go through Google's, Amazon, and others to actually have a processed data, but we can use the new European platforms and European companies to kind of pre-digest it for the final users, because this is, I think, where Europe still have to move on. And if the standards help, let's do it, and I think that we're in a good positions to start the process.
So let me ask all of you, what's next with this Copernicus? We're not going to focus only on Copernicus, but we touched upon it. So Copernicus climate, are there any future major milestones that you see in the horizon? Can we expect to see even more of that kind of service or different services?
Well, so I think when we're especially having the COP in mind, so the Conference of the Parties in Katowice at the moment, where they're discussing kind of the rule book for how are we going to implement the Paris Agreement. So part of that is a so-called global stocktake that's supposed to take place every 5 years, the first one in 2023. And part of that is reporting from individual nations. You know, we've emitted this much carbon dioxide and so on and so forth. But what I think is needed and what is planned as an initiative as part of Copernicus is to have a carbon dioxide monitoring service, which lets us estimate the human emissions of carbon dioxide.
So if I understand correctly, right now Copernicus can already detect different greenhouse gases, but now you would like to be able to plug into what the leaders of the world are doing this week in Katowice and the Paris Agreement, and you would like to be able to provide them with data that would help them monitor the implementation of the Paris Agreement?
Well, yeah, and monitor and also verify the reporting. So there are already satellites in place, not necessarily European ones, that measure CO2, so carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. But it's relatively complex because we know we have emissions, but not only humans emit carbon dioxide, but you also have vegetation. It also comes from the oceans.
It's the horrible word, no? Anthropogenic.
Anthropogenic.
That means that it's human-made, that it's not just because a cow...
Exactly, but we also have natural emissions from forests, but they also take up.
Right. So your challenge is to distinguish between the two and say this is what we humans did and this is the rest. What we humans do we can limit, the rest is natural. So this is something that I understand that Copernicus intends to do in the future. I happen to have a short video to explain in 25 seconds what it is that you're planning to do in a few years. Can we show it now? Here it is.
Copernicus, the European Union's Earth observation program, plans to build a support capacity to consistently monitor anthropogenic CO2 emissions, combining in situ and satellite observations with detailed models of the atmosphere and biosphere. The proposed Sentinels will have better performance and coverage than current satellites to achieve worldwide monitoring of CO2 emissions.
So, Vice President, that sounds too good to be true. What needs to happen in order for us to see it actually in operation?
I think the Freya is right that the thrust of the negotiations in Katowice right now is how to improve the monitoring, how to make sure that we would have what is called among the diplomats a single rule book, meaning that we would have much more precise information about how the countries are actually respecting their commitments to which they signed up in Paris and how actually they are implementing them in a real life. So until now we are very much relying on the paper reporting, and I think that the first information we are getting from our satellites is helping us to see, if we are delivering or not. But to get to that more precise level of monitoring and verification, we would need new satellites up there, the satellites for Copernicus program, which would be of the new generation, which would have that ability to distinguish between natural emissions and man-made emissions, because I think that would be very, very crucial for the future. So we need to get a good budget for the next 7 years for our space programs, which we, the Commission, propose to be at the level of 16 billion euros. And I think that rest we have, because we have great scientists. We are really superpower in making high-quality satellites. And I know that the technology exists. We just need to build these new satellites, put it up there, and I'm sure that we'll get high quality and very precise information.
So let me just remind our viewers, you wanted to jump in, let me just remind the viewers that I'm still looking at what you're sending. I'm still holding this in my hand. A lot of comments about how important it is, how happy citizens are that we have those kind of services, how important the energy transition is. A few who are wondering about the outcome of what you experience in Katowice. Maybe you can say a word about that. And one even mentioned, so this maybe I'll give some names to encourage people to comment. This one came, I think it's a Polish name, Sławomir Grodzki, who was asking about the outcome in Katowice, and there was another one that drew my attention, I think it's Spanish, Angeles Grupelli Ortega, who was saying that according to scientists, we only have 12 years to go back on our path to leap the climate disaster. And I have to say, I heard the Secretary General speak in Katowice, and he did not sound very optimistic. It was a bit alarming. So what was it like in Katowice?
I think that Secretary General was right, because scientists just presented us with very alarming IPCC report, which more or less says that if we are talking about the climate change and that overheating of 2 degrees Celsius, we just can forget about it, because it's simply too much, and our ambitions are too low. So we have to really develop our scenarios how to keep the overheating of our planet closer to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
What was the atmosphere? People felt like they were almost there?
I think that people felt it in the room, definitely all those who came to Katowice. But at the same time, I think that it's a message which we have to repeat permanently, because the people who are in the room, they are well informed. But I think that the future of the mankind, let's be so dramatic, would really depend what kind of life choices we are ready to make. Because we can set the framework, we can bring in the new technologies, but the new lifestyle must be embraced by the people, and therefore, I mean, the outreach is so important. Therefore, the information is so crucial. Therefore, also
right now.
And also the pictures we get from satellites to show how ice caps are melting, how the desertification is progressing, or what is the air pollution in our cities, because this is, I think, one of the strongest mobilizing factors that people sometimes might be hesitant to think about what happened 50 years from now. But when they see on their smartphones that it's dangerous to let the kids to the street because the pollution levels are so high that they actually can get some respiratory disease. This is what gets people moving, and I believe that this would help also to mobilize our people to be more ambitious if it comes to climate change.
And it's true that we spoke a lot about climate, but you just touched air pollution, and we had a comment, I think it was on Facebook, from Georgetta Simeon. She says, I'm in Bucharest and we're suffering from high pollution, and if I understand correctly, Copernicus does not only climate, it has a lot of different services, as one of them is indeed checking the quality of air. So
yeah, we do it in combination. Of course, the satellites are very important, but we also have the Earth station, and already with the current technology in the Copernicus, we can get pretty good information, pretty precise, that what is the level of the air pollution. But with these future satellites we are currently working on, I think we can actually pin down the air pollution also, not only to the place, but also to the source where it mostly comes from. And I think this would be very, very important for the future, because it would mobilize the people, but it will also put much more pressure on us, policymakers, to set up the policies which are definitely much better, not only for the environment, but for the health of our population.
I apologize. You wanted to jump in earlier and we got drifted away. What was it?
That's fine. I was just going to come back actually to that. It's, which is the case for the atmosphere monitoring, is that you also require a ground-based element and modeling in these exercises. And actually, I think that's what's very nice about this CO2 initiative. It brings together a whole cross-section across Europe of scientists, of people working in the satellite industry. It brings science to something that's very, very policy relevant. And I think in order to stay at kind of forefront of this kind of effort, this is what Europe also needs to keep pushing. So both the policy relevant science, also the basic science, I would say, but to have this cross-community activities to really push these things forward.
To make it pragmatic, because we're also here to try to pitch new ideas to the Vice President, anybody watching us, but also you in the studio. So your idea is what? To try to bring scientists more together and to have a spillover effect between space and climate and other fields. Is this what you're saying, or correct me?
I'm just saying I think that's a good example of when it's working well together. But I think just in general, all of these things, you can't just see them in isolation, like the satellites in isolation, or the ground-based measurements, or the entrepreneurs in isolation, or the scientists. You have to have structures in place that allow all these to interact with each other. And I think there are a lot of structures like that in place, but it's also a matter of communicating them maybe to a wider community than today, as a to step forward to.
But I think, Francesca, you mentioned that you work with scientists from other fields, also in the framework of Copernicus. I mean, is this the kind of ideas that you're looking at, or?
Well, as I said, I think a lot of these things are in place, but I think they can also just be reinforced.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm very lucky, for example, I work for a research center, the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, where we're coming from very different disciplines, and we try to integrate everything. But as Freya was saying, and to restate what the Vice President was mentioning, the key is, again, information. There are providers of information. This open data policy actually helped us, both the research community, but also the entrepreneurship community. And now we are in the position of creating the so-called climate services. There are every product and tool that transform raw climate data into useful and usable information to support decision-making at any level in every sector. And there are a bunch of examples that are actually supported by European initiatives, such as the Horizon 2020 framework, or Copernicus Climate Change Service with their demo and use cases, that they support the development, the use and the transformation of this data into something that can really be relevant at decision-making level.
So raising awareness to the private sector, to businesses, so that they know that this data exists and that they can actually make use of it?
Of course.
Jill, how did you find out about the existence of Copernicus data? Because your company, you're one of the co-founders?
Yeah.
So when you founded the company, if I understand correctly, the entire business model is based with, if it weren't for Copernicus, your company wouldn't exist as it does?
Well, there are other sources, not only from Europe, but Copernicus has made a change in the quality and in many
So
technical
how did you become aware and acquainted with this? Do you remember back when you started?
Yes, we were following what the European Center for Short-Term Weather Forecast is doing, so we follow what the innovation is. So I don't know exactly when we start to hear about Copernicus, but it was a long time before the project was a reality, when we start to see in the presentation, in the conference, in the technical workshop, that the European Commission has funded this project, and these are the results. So we were waiting, and we were ready the first day to download the data. So, and they know it.
Vice President, so far I hear do more of what you're doing already. So if I were you, I would be quite happy with.
No, we are, because I mean, with this Copernicus climate services, we've been testing them for a while, but they are in full service operations since summer, and I see how useful it is. And we've been discussing with Jill that when I was in this wind company headquarters in Pamplona, where you have companies like Gamesa, Siemens, Acciona, so they really base this business on the forecast of the wind current. And what today you can do with the technologies like Jill just presented, that you have in the middle of the room big globe, and by the arrows you can actually see how the wind situation is now, what there will be in 1 hour, in 2 hours, in 5 hours. It's so crucial not only for the success of the company, but it's very important for something which is called intermittency of renewables. That sometimes you might have. It means that it's actually those who would resolve it to the satisfaction, they will get the holy grail of renewable energies. What I mean by that, because wind, it's a little bit, of course, less predictable than solar power. And when the windmills are supplying the energy, you do not have the guarantee that it would be at the same intensity all the time. So you have volatility in the system, but if you can predict it, what would be the output, what would be the power projection, so you can combine that output of the electricity also with other sources, and then to so-called balance the tension in the grid. And of course it helps the companies to provide the complex services. So to have that forecast for by 1 hour, by 1 day, it helps you to plan better, to work with other companies to offer the good services to the customers. So it's very, very crucial, and I'm sure that in the future, especially when the windmills would be also combined with the possibilities to store energy, be it in batteries or in hydrogen or in some other media, then I think we would be much closer to what I'm sure more and more Europeans want, to have really emission-less power generation and to have the climate neutral economy.
Yeah, Jill?
Just to emphasize the role that projects like Copernicus have in the wind industry, it's important to mention the offshore wind energy. That is obviously the future for Europe and the rest of the world, especially now that we are having the floating wind turbines start to be there. So, and in offshore we don't measure because it's very expensive. It's hugely expensive to put a wind mast on the middle of the sea. Yeah. So we rely on technology like satellite, like Copernicus, and our models as well. So this is a must. Without that, we couldn't be able to explore the sea.
And if you look at the project, which is now very much promoted by the Western European countries, the so-called North Sea offshore grid. So the idea is to have the 100 gigawatts of wind power installation, which is really huge. And for that, to make such an investment decision, you must have very precise picture. What is the wind current? What would be the return of the investment? And that's especially, as you said, in offshore area without proper information from satellites, it would be impossible.
So it sounds like there's a lot of spillover between different sectors. And indeed, we had a question from within the House, from the energy services here in the Commission. Marguerite Gaze was asking, how do we make sure that we spoke about communicating it to others, but even we ourselves, we make sure that we always use the data that comes from satellites. So she happens to work in energy, but we have services in the Commission for agriculture, for security, for border control. How do we make sure that we make use of that kind of satellite data and implement it wherever it's relevant in our policy making? I
think we realized that with this commission that if you want really to make the breakthrough in this very complex policy making, that we need to get rid of the silos and be really very cross-disciplinary, and that was the idea behind the teams, and it was the idea behind the Energy Union, when I was actually very privileged that in my team I had 14 commissioners. So it means that I had a lot of friends. I had to have a lot of coffees with them to agree on the policies, on the legislative proposals.
So 14 out of 28. We have one commissioner per country. Yes. 14 out of 28 are part of the Energy Union.
Exactly. This just shows how very much intertwined it is that because I think it's exactly what we discuss here, this satellite. For example,
what do you have in your team? Which kind of...
I mean, we have, of course, the Energy Climate Commissioner, the Commissioner responsible for industry and space, then, of course, trade, agriculture, Commissioner responsible for the high seas and fisheries and for environment, and I can go on and on and on, because in one way...
To make sure they speak to each other and that they work together?
I would say we speak to each other. What is even more important, and that was, I think, the question which was asked by Margarita, to make sure that services talk to each other, because that's sometimes even more conservative than the commissioners, just to simply make it very clear from the beginning that we approach it as a common task. There shouldn't be just, one dissection of the policies, then another one, because then, of course, it might happen and then it's or not so efficient, or as we had it in the past, that sometimes the policies are contradictory to each other. So we try to make sure that we'll bring this teamwork and kind of political steer already at the beginning of the process, and then ask services to work together and to bring us something which we can then present as a joint effort and as a result of our common policies. Because today, not to benefit from all that new technologies, that new information, and from the need to cooperate, it would really be a big mistake. And I think we started like this, and I'm sure that the next Commission will continue.
And how has it worked out for you after almost the end of the mandates?
I think that the only anxiety I have right now, before I can say Energy Union mission accomplished, because we will really deliver on all the promises and commitments we included in the Energy Union strategy in February 2015, is actually the picture which is behind you, and that's the clean mobility package, because we have a few months left, and I hope we'll be able to agree on the new emission standards for cars, vans, trucks and buses, because we are already a little bit lagging behind, surprise, surprise, behind Chinese, who became the biggest producers of electric cars and electric buses, and I think we should claim back really the leadership in this segment as well.
Okay, I think the audience is waking up. I have Carlo Buontempo. Is that how you pronounce it in Italian?
Buontempo.
Buontempo.
Yes.
And he commented both on YouTube and on LinkedIn, and he stresses the fact that it's critical that the data is free. So I think you, Jill, also mentioned this aspect of Copernicus, which is so important for you. He's also making a point about the fact that the EU must keep funding these fundamental research and programs. So I think Carlo, if you're still watching us, the Vice President was also voicing his hope that the new budget is going to come across as it was proposed. What else do we have for you? There are some comments about the international cooperation around Copernicus. So we mentioned it was a European project. It was Jaroslav Misiak was asking, no, sorry, I'm going to go back to Jaroslav. It was someone else. Now I'm getting confused with my questions, but how do we work with other parts of the world?
Okay, so we can, with just a couple of examples for the climate change service, we have close cooperation with NOAA. So we have monthly telephone conferences with them to discuss what they work on, what we work on, and also have some projects in common with them actually. So not on the, well, not in that case on satellites, but on in situ, so ground-based measurements to try to put these together. So the archives they have of kind of rescuing data, and we have we're working on that with them. But then, of course,
so that is with whom you said?
With NOAA.
That's American.
With the American,
okay.
What's it called? National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency, exactly. And for satellites, so if we look at, for instance, some of the Copernicus products from the climate change service, we do reprocessing, it's called, of satellites to get a long-term continuous record, and that's partly based on satellites that the
so
Europeans
Europe is not alone in space.
No.
We're working with our partners, and I heard your Vice President say that it was very much appreciated in some of your meetings around the world, mostly by Americans who thanked you for the Copernicus.
Yeah, I mean, it was, of course, I'm trying to. I studied at Stanford, so I tried to return back every 3-4 years just to see what's new in Silicon Valley, and to go to see the partners from NASA and from all these big tech companies. And of course, I mean, you feel very proud as a European if they tell you, you know, I mean, this data we get from your satellites is really best on the planet. It's high quality. We are so happy we can share it with you. And then they tell you that in how many very concrete cases it helped them. And I think in the cases like we have now, the fires in California, or some rescue missions at the sea, so that we can actually help in that respect is very, very important. And I just learned before coming to the studio that we are talking today a lot about climate change, but actually number one user in this house of our satellite services is our emergency DG ECHO, because usually when we have some weather-related disaster, they are first, of course, to get a phone call that something very bad is happening. Can we have your satellite maps? Can we have a prediction, some modeling, what will happen tomorrow, how dangerous it is? And I think here Europeans are playing really the leading role globally to be first, I would say, not only on the side, but the first with the relevant information to know what kind of dimension of this disaster is and how, I would say, the global community can come.
And that goes
rescue.
back also to the question we had earlier about our services talking to each other. So here we have very different services, one which is doing humanitarian aid and civil protection. Another one is running satellites in space, but they make sure that the data from space reaches those who need it here and providing action. So in the end, as you mentioned, the silos are breaking to some extent. And if I understood what you were saying before, Europe is quite autonomous today. We are the one providing the data to the rest of the world, but we're also working in cooperation. So there's a fine balance there between being independent, but also making sure that we reinforce each other.
And I think also we have to work together. So we also work together with the WMO, for instance, as the World Organization for the World Meteorological Organization. I don't know if you saw their statement just before the COP. It's a statement about the state of the climate, that 2018 is likely to be one of the 4th warmest years on record, following the last 3 years.
Every year, no? It's like, it's...
Well, yeah, so the last 4 years have been the last four warmest years. And there, Copernicus and other European partners provide data to that, but I think in order to have a comprehensive view, you also need to cooperate with others. Yeah.
And just for the sake of justice of different services and space programs that the EU does, I feel like we speak a lot about Copernicus, but there's also Galileo and EGNOS, which are quite big, and I feel like they're also relevant for this discussion about climate change and energy transition, no, Vice President? I mean,
I think Galileo definitely, because I think in the next decade we would be in very privileged position, because actually in Europe we would be able to provide the most precise localization services on this planet. So we we're talking
How precise?
civilian use 20 centimeters.
20 centimeters.
20 centimeters.
I put a chip now on my glasses,
and
satellite.
We'll find it. we'll make the precise location. And you know, and it's actually very, very important because today we are depending, of course, on the quality of the signal somewhere between 7 to 10 meters. So you can imagine what
from
kind
7
of
to 10 to 20 centimeters.
to 20 centimeters. So what kind of difference it might have for example, visual impaired people? Because I saw one startup from Spain, and they're actually developing the app that with the Galileo services they can actually navigate the people across the streets and this narrow urban canyon with big precision. Because
so maybe just to explain, Galileo are EU satellites also in space, similar to Copernicus, but instead of taking selfies of Earth and just taking pictures of us, they provide us with geolocalization.
Exactly. Geolocalization, they're providing us with the precise timekeeping, because they have this very precise atomic clock, and we use them from everything from time stamping on banking transaction to the precise localization of the planes for safe landing.
So in almost every sector.
We need it. I mean, we calculated that. I mean, if it comes to localization and navigation services, almost 10% of the European GDP depends on this infrastructure. Therefore, we very much pushed for having this, I would say, geostrategic autonomy and having our own system, because if somebody would switch it off, we really would be in a deep trouble. Imagine all the trucks, planes, ships, which are now absolutely dependent on localization services.
If I understand correctly, both Copernicus and Galileo are fairly new services in operation, no?
We are kind of lucky that we managed to put up there the new generation of satellites. So if it comes to navigation services or to the Earth observation service, we can actually provide the best quality because they're newer satellites. But of course, it would be very important to keep it up, to replace them when it's needed, when the new technology comes and can provide better services, just to keep that leading position. And just one more word on Galileo. We are talking a lot about emissions, about transport, about the fact that from transport emissions we get 25% of greenhouse gases, I mean, on the planet. So just imagine that when we would be able to use that data better for more precision logistic, for better use of trucks, for more precise routing of our planes, and for better planning of the public transport. All this should be possible, and with connected automated driving, we can even make the leap forward and really to reduce by the new technologies the greenhouse gas emissions.
So all these different technologies that you described, from autonomous driving to our phones, which are also using geolocalization, they all depend in the end on satellites,
yes.
And they could depend on EU satellites, whether it's Galileo or Copernicus.
Yeah. Galileo for navigation, localization, Copernicus for Earth observation.
And so Copernicus started, I understand, full services this year. Galileo is still in initial services. So basically, this is all happening as we speak. Yeah. This is new services coming. I was going to stay on the ground, but in the sky?
Galileo offered the early services already. I mean, it was my plea when I was in Kourou when we've been launching the new set of satellites. So my plea with the scientific community there was, please give us the Christmas present and
offer us
2 years ago, offer us the early services, and they actually did. So it happened, and we will have the already now. I mean, you have all the new smartphones that are already equipped with the chips for Galileo. So I think we have currently 400 million users of that localization service. So it's quite significant, and we will have the full constellation of 30 satellites up there by 2020. So it's fairly new infrastructure, very important one, high quality, and I think that it's good also through this transmission to underline the fact that this is the infrastructure which belongs to the Europeans. Both Copernicus and satellites, the European infrastructure funded by EU money.
Someone even asked, I misquoted him earlier, Jaroslav Misiak, who asked earlier on YouTube if we know the economic value generated by climate services. So I don't know if anybody has that figure from the top of their heads, but I'm assuming that these are very significant.
I probably should have, but I don't, because I'm terrible with those kind of numbers.
No pressure, we're live.
But
you can add them in the comments when you go back to the office. You go to this post, you add it, and you answer him. You will be very happy.
Yeah. Very good. But I think there are estimates, but I'm not going to say a number, because if I say a number, I will be quoted for that, and I will be quoted wrongly. So
I can say that it's not for climate change, but I can say that 1% that we are able to reduce on the uncertainty of the feasibility of a wind farm can have an impact of €1 million.
Wait, say it again. 1%?
1% that we are able to reduce uncertainty on the wind speed.
The certainty, so 1%?
Uncertainty, the bias, the error.
Okay, so reducing the error of 1% in wind energy.
In the wind energy for a wind project that is in development can have an impact of €1 million on a typical 100 megawatt wind farm. This is a number, just to give you an idea of how important it is for us that Copernicus become better in the new version, etc. Because now we are not just working for providing data for Europe, that more or less we know the resources, but we are providing data for China, for India, for Africa. We expect a lot in Africa wind energy in the future, so it's important that we are able to reduce uncertainty.
Okay, I'm getting screams in my headphone that we need to start concluding soon. I allow myself one last question because I'm an AI geek. I really like artificial intelligence. I think it's mind-blowing. You're producing so much data. Are we nearing the phase when we won't need people to actually interpret that data, but basically an algorithm would replace you, Jill, and will tell us where we need to plant those windmills, and we will be able to find those trends within the data? Or am I now again throwing a bomb here that I know you're not AI scientists, but I think you told me that you see scientists from other fields working on space data.
But what I can tell you is that machine learning or AI are huge supporting all this movement, and they're very relevant for technology.
What?
They're supporting also the creation of climate services and the processes of data, the use of data. But it's also
Copernicus
true,
and space data in general.
Including every possible source of satellite
so please
and
tell them we like them too.
observation.
They should.
We like them too a lot because they're actually supporting quite significantly. But it's also important to engage the user in this process, to communicate to the user the science that is behind. Because it's not just the satellite or the space technology, but there is quite some relevant science that has been going on in the past decades. And that science enters into a user-friendly product in a way that the user can understand it, but without any limit or barrier. And that is the incredible work that overall, collectively, we're trying to do.
It's totally fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, we need to start concluding, so I don't know if you want to have last words, each of you, and then I'll let the Vice President tell us how he feels about this exercise. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I should maybe just underline what Jill said about the wind farms and knowing when you do the planning, you need to be climate smart even then. So it's not only in the wind farms about knowing what's happening tomorrow, so you can kind of steer, am I going to put this, use this station or not? But actually, when you plan it, you need to know not only in general it's cold and rainy in the UK or in the south of Sweden, but how often are you likely to have peaks of wind? How often are you likely to have no wind?
So you're looking at patterns and not only at specific points in time.
So you need to look back in time, but also presently look much forward in time.
And how good are we in that?
And forward in time?
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it forecasting when it's decades ahead, but to try to project for wind is difficult. For temperature, it's easier.
Well, Jill is almost there in predicting.
Well, we look back in time, but we are also interested in what's happening in the future. So my conclusion is that the wind industry is a main user of Copernicus. Europe has a target that the 30% or more of the electric demand in 2040 came from the wind. So we need to pass many barriers, but one very important is to have good information to accelerate the project.
Whether it comes from Earth or from space.
Wherever it comes from. But in a global market like the wind industry, we need global information.
So the more the better, basically. More sources.
And global.
Okay, Francesca, do you want to? I feel like you bring all different hats here. You're a founder of a startup, and you're a researcher, and you're a trainer, and you're doing a bit of everything. So, what's your conclusion of this discussion?
This is possible because the world is going toward very
I don't know when you sleep because you seem young, so
interdisciplinary direction. But my suggestion in a way is also to foster this cooperation between the two communities, so space and climate, like fostering the human mobility schemes, fostering the interaction across sectors of scientists that can can get together and build something new and innovative. The mantra of our startup is "Get Shift Done," and it looks very, I don't know,
Get shift done.
Get shift done, because it's important to use this information to make the shift toward the climate smart world. And Copernicus Climate Change Service is super helpful in that. So I really look forward to see what's happened next, definitely.
Okay, Vice President, how was this for you?
No, I think it was fascinating, and it just, I think, proved what I always knew, that we have great young people in Europe who are excellent in what they do, that we have a lot of innovative minds, we have a lot of innovative ideas, and what we have to do is to make sure that the young people would go for vacations, travel, but they would stay here and develop the ideas in Europe. They don't have to go overseas to Silicon Valley or to China to develop the ideas related to space and climate, because I think in this case we are quite privileged in Europe that we have the strongest public support for the climate policies. Everywhere else it's much more difficult. So let's use that support, let's use these bright minds, and I think the practical advice, like we heard from Francesca, get shift done, and to have even more mergers between space, climate, and I would say all other climate-related policies would be great, and I think we just need to find even more user-friendly mechanisms how we can really support the young people with such bright ideas like we had with us today.
Okay, so on this very optimistic note of getting shift done all over Europe, let me thank all of you, Francesca, Vice President, Jill, and Freya. And thank you for watching us and for sending your comments. If this was useful for you, feel free to share it. Who knows, maybe someone else in your community is also a space climate geek and will appreciate that. Have a lovely evening from all of us here in Brussels. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.